This is the Enragés, a show where we take a deeper dive into written works published at the Center for a Stateless Society. Join us as we give voice to the ideas challenging the vain phantoms that haunt our social reality and stand in the way of total liberation. For more information, visit c4ss.org. And to support this show or any of the other projects happening at the center, please visit patreon.com/c4ss.org. Thank you for listening. Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Enragés. I'm your host, Joel Williamson. Today we'll be joined by Ray Ling, an anarchist without adjectives interested in economics and markets, to discuss their article published at the Center for a Stateless Society last year on May 24th, 2020. It also appeared in the Anarchist Library. The piece is an exploration of how anarchic, post-capitalist organizing might affect production and consumption trends without making any explicit prescriptions on the content of anarchy. This article is called Scarcity and Abundance Under Anarchism, and I'm excited to take a deep dive into this engaging piece. Ray Ling, welcome to the show.
Thanks for the intro. Good to be here.
Of course. So, of all issues to tackle, why did you choose to focus on scarcity and abundance?
So what initially prompted me to write this piece was grappling with the idea of anti-civ anarchism, which I don't explicitly say in the essay. I've had a lot of discussions with anti-civ anarchists, and I haven't, some of their arguments were somewhat appealing to me, yet at the same time, I disagree with them. There's a few different definitions of anti-civ, and the logic behind it tends to vary. It's a very vague term. Sometimes it's just a euphemism for primitivism, where humanity has a sort of fixed species essence, which causes us to become alienated from modernity. I just think this is arbitrary essentialism. There's a lot of people who aren't alienated by technology. So I don't really take that particular argument very seriously. But etymologically speaking, anti-civ refers to opposition to cities. And I don't agree with this either. And insofar as it refers to the aesthetics of cities or something like that, then I also don't take this point of view very seriously. But the typical underlying logic behind this point of view is what I'm really trying to apply in the essay, which is the idea that given existing levels of technology, abolishing rulers would make certain social structures less likely as costs are redistributed and no longer externalized onto workers, marginalized groups, and the environment, making some goods more scarce and others more abundant, which is where the topic came from. The problem with anti-civ anarchists in general is that they don't have a coherent framework, like the externalization of costs for thinking about these issues, and also don't consider the range of possibilities that exist. For example, they might argue that we should abolish mining or agriculture because of what they're like under capitalism without considering why both are highly exploitative industries. The same applies to cities. Like when I step outside, I can see that just about everything in my field of vision is the result of someone getting exploited and environmental destruction. But that doesn't mean we can or should abandon technology or agriculture. There's a way of producing things that doesn't rely on forced labor and destroying the environment, but there'll still be certain implications for how abundant or scarce certain goods might be.
That's interesting to know that you were grappling with anti-civ ideas, or that inspired you to some extent. Toward the beginning of the article, you articulate a relatively standard left-wing market anarchist insight that, quote, the interdependent nature of corporations and the state is a feature of capitalism, not a bug. How exactly does the state and its favored clients benefit from their monopoly on violence?
Well, the way they benefit from the monopoly on violence and the legitimization of government, both of which allow the state to exist, is reflected in quite a few different ways, like material wealth, the ease of migration. Most people who are citizens of developed countries are exempt from getting visas, which means that they have more labor mobility compared to people from less developed countries. Also just not being discriminated against and being subject to less violence as a result of things like systemic racism. One particular example is that fixed title and deed over property allows initial owners to maintain absentee ownership over land and collect rents. And this is often based on colonialism and through investing wealth generated through economic rent.
You talk about the, quote, reproduction of daily life and how we reproduce capitalism by participating in its institutions. You point out that it does this by constricting our options through violence, forcing us to depend on it for survival. This in turn fosters sort of a spiritually void culture that worships hierarchy and bureaucracy. Capitalism requires our labor, but does it also require the death of our imaginations?
So I don't think it necessarily leads to the death of our imagination, but it does incentivize people to follow certain imperatives because, as I say in the essay, dissidence is penalized and conformity is rewarded. So there's often a disconnect between one's ideals and their actions. And that's largely a result of incentives. Like, I think everyone who participates in capitalism is also part of reproducing it. I don't think it's easy for people to simply stop enacting capitalism. And to overcome it, we need to change the incentives by actually building the new world in the shell of the old, which is the common anarchist slogan. So in this sense, anarchism is not just negation. It's also, the abolition of rulers is also a generative process.
That makes complete sense. I guess I was just sort of thinking, because there's a point in your article where you point out that capitalism sort of creates this culture where like the height of meaning is climbing the corporate ladder. And it sort of stunts our idea of what's possible in a way.
Yeah, I think capitalism is very like emotionally draining. So yeah, that makes sense to me.
At one point in the article, you point out how capitalism and the state have developed methods to constrain resistance and limit any struggle against it. You say, quote, dissidence is reconstituted into the status quo, producing stabilizing incremental change. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that?
Sure. So here I'm referring to ideas like democratic socialism that emphasize reform through the political system. Certain people have fairly decent critiques of capitalism. I don't fully agree with them. But the problem is that I think their solutions maintain the fundamental structures of capitalism. And these ideologies and narratives tend to benefit the existing ruling class of capitalism. So, for example, the Bernie Sanders campaign portrayed itself as a radical movement. But at the end of the day, Bernie Sanders is just another authoritarian and probably wouldn't have fulfilled any of his promises even if he was elected to lead the American regime. There's this common notion that things could be different under capitalism. For example, when the corporations were bailed out after the COVID lockdown last year, a lot of people were asking why the government bailed out corporations instead of individuals. But I don't think it could have been any other way. That's just how the incentives of capitalism line up. So first of all, the fate of corporations is the fate of capitalism. They have a larger marginal contribution to the economy than any individual. And if, say, the airline industry went bankrupt, then a lot of people would have become fully unemployed rather than simply just furloughed. And also from a nationalistic perspective, which is part of the structure of capitalism, letting your national airline industry go bankrupt is just doesn't make sense in this context of competing nation states vying for more power. Secondly, the tools available to central banks, which is buying various debt securities, like programs like quantitative easing and yield curve control, by nature benefit corporations and the biggest holders of corporate debt, which are just hedge funds and other investment funds, which your average person wouldn't have a very large stake in. So I think capitalism just almost deterministically, or just based on incentives, would bail out the ruling class. And I think if a critique of capitalism doesn't consider the underlying incentives of capitalism, then it's not really a substantive critique.
Critiques of the status quo come from all directions on the political spectrum. There's a related line in your article that I'd like to read real quick. The right wing tends to critique the superficial qualities of modern consumption patterns as aesthetically gaudy, homogenizing, and capable of transcending defunct traditional structures. The real issue is that certain material excesses seen in relatively privileged communities, regions, and countries are only possible because of the economic rent extraction and environmental destruction in the developing world and low-income communities, mostly comprised of people of color. My question for you is, if this sort of right-winger followed their critique to its logical conclusion, would they be forced to embrace anti-capitalism and anti-racism?
So the right-wing critique of consumerism, which I'm referencing here, doesn't focus on the economic exploitation and modern patterns of consumption, but the aesthetics of it, which are largely incidental and don't really have any fixed political orientation. One example of this is like that consumer meme. I think it came out of 4chan like a few years ago, which criticizes a tendency to value material possessions over like spiritual fulfillment. And as far as I'm concerned, this depends on the individual, so I don't really place too much emphasis on it. So I think the logical conclusion of their own critique might be something like banning anime or something like that, because they see it as degenerate.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like one example of this is that there's this far-right Twitter account called Woke Capital, which points out examples of corporations peddling liberal identity politics. And it critiques these corporations for promoting anti-racism, whereas I would criticize the corporations for their blatant hypocrisy on the matter, given that they exploit cheap labor and pollute the environment.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned it a few times in your article, but what is monopsony power? And what would markets look like without its influence?
So monopsony power is a situation where hiring competition between firms is artificially lowered, giving corporations and basically all small and medium-sized businesses power over sellers, which could refer to workers, and it could also refer to just everyday consumers. So although many would say that monopsony power occurs when the market is dominated by a few firms, even relatively competitive markets still benefit from government intervention in favor of employers, which allows even small firms to make economic profits in the long run by paying workers less than their marginal revenue product. Without the influence of monopsony power, I think we basically see a free market where if a buyer doesn't offer a seller a price they're willing to part with the products of their labor, then they would simply go to someone else. And that would drive up wages and also reduce profit margins over time. Monopsony power is one of the reasons behind the farmer protests in India. That's just one example. The middlemen who transport and resell products are all large bulk buyers. So the striking farmers want to maintain government intervention because it gives them what's referred to as minimum support prices, which is also technically a form of monopoly. The state as monopsony power leads to waste and prices certain farmers out of the market. So I don't think that's a good thing either. The real solution here, I think, would be to work towards a truly free market, because then the distribution of costs is determined in a peer-to-peer framework rather than imposed from the top down, which is how reformism in general tends to work.
Right. I like how you incorporate an explanation of not only how the state violently perpetuates itself, but also why it does. This piece of the puzzle seems essential because if we wish to unravel the ruling class's schemes, we'd likely benefit from an accurate description of their motivations. Can you explain why they insist on robbing, surveilling, and restricting the rest of us?
I think that primary motivation is to simply accumulate and maintain power, which comes with zero-sum benefits, like being able to leech off the labor of others, which can manifest as wealth and other forms of privilege. It's a sort of positive feedback loop of power. There's no real universal historical narrative behind the emergence of states, but I imagine they primarily emerged to protect the incidental privilege of certain groups, allowing them to benefit at the expense of others. And that in turn creates the incentive for them to continue to surveil, restrict, and rob people.
There are also second-order effects that capitalist markets seem to inevitably produce, such as things that you point out in your article, like gross inequality, mass surveillance, corruption, colonialism, xenophobia, and war, amongst other things. These second-order effects are usually interconnected in interesting ways, and I'd like to explore some of these topics with you. The first is sort of about the fragility of supply chain within capitalism. The relevance of your article seems to be making itself obvious with recent events related to climate change and the pandemic. Again, we all depend on these captive markets for survival, yet they reveal themselves to be fragile in moments of crisis. How do we go from state subsidy and monopsony power to empty shelves?
So I think to answer that question, I would first think about why subsidies and monopsony power are related. And I think that in general, capitalism leads to increased centralization and resources accrue to a few entities. Typically, subsidies occur when the government is sort of in a very high level, abstract sense, redistributing resources from one group to another. And that's usually undertaken through taxation, which is dependent on force. And over time, that leads to the accrual of power in just a few entities. And in a centralized system, when one node fails, it can lead to systemic failures that aren't experienced equally by all. For example, the pandemic lockdowns also applied to regions with relatively few cases. And just in general, I think that in terms of the pandemic response, it would have been more effective to simply leave it up to different individuals and maybe even communities, because they can work on local context, which top-down systems completely lack knowledge of. So decentralized systems can adapt more to local conditions. And if one node in a network system fails, there are still many others that can fill in the gaps, leading to more resilience. So using Taleb's terminology, decentralized systems are more anti-fragile.
How does the lack of bottom-up accountability lead to closed-source, unrecyclable goods that fuel endless cycles of consumption and waste?
Things like planned obsolescence and black box products dominate the market, I think particularly due to intellectual property, which gives corporation market power, and that makes them less accountable to consumers. And as a result of that, we have various consumer rights movements like the right to repair that exist because the IP regulations prevent you from disassembling certain electronics. And that additionally gives corporations a monopoly on repair. And that's once again a cost that is sort of externalized onto consumers. And they could probably get the same service. It would probably be a lot cheaper for them if they could simply disassemble products on their own, repair them, and maybe even have access to a competitive repair market. So I'm pretty sure the only place you can get an iPhone legally fixed is the Genius Bar, which is a massive source of inefficiency. And then secondly, the artificially cheap nature of certain production inputs like metals also allows a huge turnover in things like smartphones because the cost that they're produced on is artificially cheap. So in that sense, I think that particular business model would be outcompeted by consumers just purchasing spare parts for their devices if they're out of date in a relatively free market. So I think that could even happen just by abolishing laws that prevent consumers from repairing their own products, which is, I think, essentially part of intellectual property.
Right. You also highlight how the suppression of labor leads to certain consumption choices being made artificially cheap, which leads to even more ecological destruction. How does that work?
For the most part, I think the suppression of labor costs and ecological destruction as two distinct components of capitalism. That said, I do have a chapter where I explore the different ways in which they interact. So, for example, artificially low costs force workers to work longer hours to meet their target levels of income, and longer working hours often have a carbon footprint. So if workers are able to demand higher hourly wages, then they may actually end up working fewer hours. But then if we're getting into the sort of nuances of it, it also depends on the nature of work. I imagine 1 hour of work may also be relatively less carbon intensive in a post-capitalist economy. Also, the inflexibility in the labor market that forces down labor costs may have environmental implications, like the need to work in person, forcing workers to commute. This culture has been eroded due to the pandemic, although many companies do want to go back to the old ways. Like the CEO of Goldman Sachs recently called working from home an aberration. And of course, I don't think we can expect anything else from Goldman Sachs.
Right. You mentioned a report claiming none of the world's top 20 region sectors with the highest environmental impact would be profitable after accounting for environmental externalities, with margins ranging from 67% of cement manufacturing to 1% of petroleum and natural gas extraction. What are some of the other sectors being referred to here, and what are their actual environmental externalities?
So just a disclaimer before I answer the question, I don't think that these numbers are super accurate just because of the massive scope of the study. I think the numbers may actually be significantly higher, but they do put into perspective the sheer scale of externalized environmental costs. So the region sectors in order of impact, I sort of repeat a lot in the top 20 because they're separated by type of emission as well as region. So they include coal power generation in East Asia, cattle ranching in South America, iron and steel mills in East Asia, wheat farming in South Asia, coal power generation in North America. One of them is also the global fishing industry. In some cases, water supply. So there's quite a few different sectors. And the total scale of the environmental externalities is around 2.7 trillion US dollars, which is a huge sum.
Mm-hmm. So what impact would this have on car culture? I mean, would it even be possible without the state?
So I think it would make car culture as we know it impossible, with a lot of emphasis on the as we know it part, because what I really mean here is that I think automobiles and automobile infrastructure might become more expensive. I think that people would produce and use cars, and there's a lot of existing infrastructure for that. So I'm not saying that we should abolish cars or anything like that, although I do know it's a popular slogan for anarchists, and I don't really begrudge people for using it. Furthermore, like automobile infrastructure has relied on things like right-of-way programs, which amounts to the state buying out people who live in the path of freeways, which also takes up more space than things that like rail, so it has a higher environmental impact. At the same time, electric cars do make me optimistic about the future of cars, although the parts used in electric cars still do rely on carbon-intensive processes and forced labor. So I was recently reading about Elon Musk investing in lithium mining, and I think pretty much across the board, the practices used in lithium mining are exploitative and just generally essentially amount of forced labor. So in order for car culture to really thrive, I think the market needs to find a way around these things. And I do think that is possible, albeit with new distribution of costs, which may lead to higher prices for end consumers.
Right. And as we mentioned a couple questions ago, the suppression of bargaining power for labor is a necessary feature of capitalism. We know that competition offers labor more options and thus more bargaining power. Yet you wrote that, quote, state intervention drives total compensation below the marginal disutility of labor by also directly reducing worker bargaining power, even in relatively competitive capitalist markets. This lack of bargaining power is caused by the reification of the employer-employee relationship. How is the employer-employee relationship reified in ways that go beyond the systematic elimination of competition?
What I'm referring to here is the relatively competitive markets under capitalism. So small and medium-sized businesses still benefit from various legal protections like fixed title and deed over property, non-compete clauses, and so on, giving them legal authority over employees. And that allows them to control things like compensation, the length of the work week, and working conditions. So while there's competition between firms for labor is still at a systematic disadvantage, even when the labor market is not dominated by a few firms, which is what monopsony refers to in traditional economic literature. So this goes slightly beyond the scope of the standard monopsony model, which is when a few firms compete for a pool of workers in a given area. But at the same time, it's not completely alien to the initial conceptualization of monopsony power, because Joan Robinson was, I think, something of an anti-capitalist, and she was the one who came up with the concept. So, for example, one of the papers I cite in the essay, Antitrust Remedies for Labor Market Power, argues that the labor share of income in so-called competitive markets is around 2/3, which I still find relatively low. So depending on how one defines labor, I would expect it to be a lot higher in an actually free market, depending on your definitions, possibly closer to 100%.
I wonder how badly those numbers were affected after COVID.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we saw, I think, the largest wealth transfer in the history of capitalism. That's what I've read, actually.
So how did they get the numbers for that study?
On a high level, it's at least the methodology they use in the study is that they build a general equilibrium model of a competitive market based on certain assumptions. And those assumptions are basically the same ones that are used by neoclassical economists, which include things like fixed title and deed over property, which would mean that employers have authority over their employees. So in that sense, I would say that their model of a competitive market perhaps isn't quite as competitive as an anarchist freed market. And then they compare that general equilibrium model to existing monopsonized labor markets. And to do that, they looked at some of the existing literature on monopsony and did a sort of meta-analysis. And they also included how the labor share of economic output based on the elasticity of supply of labor. That was an important part of their studies. And they had sort of a threshold in the elasticity of supply of labor to determine what counts as a monopsonized labor market and what doesn't.
So speaking of employment numbers and labor power, if freed markets produce higher labor costs and incentivize investments in the automation of labor, what does this mean for the future of work?
I think this really depends on the individual. In many cases, consumers may be willing and able to pay higher prices for certain goods and services. But if we think about it in sort of systemic terms, in terms of incentives, then overall this would decrease the relative price of capital to labor. And by capital, I mean like machinery, technology, automated production, the use of tools to make labor more efficient. So that would mean that the price ratio of capital to labor would go down. And I think that increases the incentive to invest in automation technology. In this situation, we might see automation gradually replace labor, which is the same process we'd see under capitalism, but possibly at more rapid rates in certain cases, because capitalism does allow firms to externalize its costs onto workers and the environment by sort of protecting concentrations of private power. So, and at the same time, I think it's extremely complex because it's not just labor costs that would change. As this happens, I expect workers would have more options under anarchism, like retiring to the commons and undergoing retraining as compared to capitalism, as they're gradually replaced by technology, that is.
Yeah, a lot of these topics revolve around the distortion of prices that capitalism causes. You point out how some things are made artificially cheap due to direct and indirect subsidization in industries such as meat, fossil fuels, most electronics, imported food, and more. But conversely, you point out how monopsony power also leads to higher profit margins and prices due to artificial scarcity. Can you clarify what products are made more or less expensive under capitalism?
Yeah, so in the essay, I mostly do just lay out a framework for thinking about these questions and then provide a few examples. So it's really a contingent question that depends on existing levels of technology and methods of production. So I think about it more in terms of processes, which I didn't explicitly mention in my essay. For example, I think raw metals may become more expensive given current methods of production, which might increase the price of all goods that rely on them, which is a lot, too many to list. But at the same time, we might see more recycling as a consequence of this increase in prices, which might in turn put downward pressure on prices. And I think another example of this could be meat. So right now, meat production is environmentally destructive, and meeting demand for meat relies on factory farming, which essentially amounts to domination over animals. They're like sort of prisons for animals. And the fact that we're not able to externalize these costs onto animals and farm workers might decrease the relative price of lab-grown meat, which spurs the development of that particular technology. So there's a lot of these different processes that might take place, where some goods become more expensive, and then we see pressures that make them less expensive. And I think this is just a general feature of markets. Looking at particular industries is a very good way of thinking about the question. And especially, I think the best way of thinking about the question is to look at supply chains. Like, you have the stage of the supply chain where you're getting your raw materials. And I think that's often one of the areas where capitalism really does externalize costs onto workers and the environment. So, for example, manual labor, people working in dangerous conditions in mines. So that might be a good way of thinking about which specific goods might be more or less expensive under capitalism, and how that might change as we transition into a post-capitalist future.
So it's true then that poor people reap the benefit of low prices. So why then should they prefer moving beyond capitalism?
Overall, I guess that's because I think the benefits would outweigh the costs for most workers. I think that if we apply methodological individualism, we can't say that a specific worker might prefer capitalism over any other system. It's quite possible that they actually prefer capitalism to all the other alternatives, even if they are being paid less. Like, one of the concepts I use earlier in the essay, which is the marginal disutility of labor, is actually a subjective measure. And when I make these particular critiques, I'm thinking about the average marginal disutility of labor. So there's certainly consumers who, for their own subjective reasons, do benefit more from capitalism than any other system. And I don't think that's something that can really be changed. But overall, I would say that certain groups may benefit from things like cheap chicken breasts on supermarket shelves, but the externalization of labor and environmental costs far outweighs the low price for certain goods. So it's kind of you can almost quantify it as a cost-benefit analysis for individual workers. At the same time, for many goods, anarchism may incentivize abundance, particularly things like healthcare and food. So for those goods, we could certainly see the prices fall due to things like competition, open sourcing, the abolition of licensing, and so on. So, yeah.
I think lots of people don't take a step back to consider the broader context of why they're working so much and for such little pay. I mean, if you asked any ordinary person, they might tell you it's because they have to pay for rent, and that's just how things are. How would removing the externalization of cost affect things like rent and consumer demand for housing?
So I think abolishing absentee ownership would firstly increase the supply of housing, which would put downward pressure on prices. There's this really common talking point that there's more vacant homes in the United States than there are homeless people. So from that point of view, I think almost everyone could be housed. Additionally, I think abolishing zoning laws that prevent new construction would also lead to lower prices. So without the state, NIMBYs would not have, for anyone who doesn't know what NIMBYs refers to, it refers to sort of people who, the acronym stands for Not in My Backyard. And they essentially use the state or local government to prevent the construction of new housing. And I don't think that would be possible in an anarchic context. So the supply of housing could actually increase in response to more demand. Additionally, I think that without these structures, the amount you pay for housing would be realized through use, whereas absentee ownership conventions emphasize property retaining its value for resale. So I think a change in property conventions could also sort of drastically lower the cost of housing and effectively abolish any need for rent.
Awesome. There's another part in your article that I'd like you to expound on, if you don't mind. It's where you write that, with all this in mind, it's worth revisiting my previous point about systemic breakdown creating new avenues for social change. While the internalization of costs destroy possibilities that rely on the exploitation of labor and environmental destruction, it increases new possibilities by making new technologies, mode of organization, and cooperative interaction increasingly viable. What does all that mean?
So, increasing labor and environmental costs in certain conditions decrease the relative price of investing in certain technologies in those same areas. So, going back to the beginning of our conversation, anti-civ anarchists may say increasing costs means we just see more scarcity across the board. We would no longer be able to produce technology. We wouldn't be able to, in some cases, farm. But what's really happening is a realignment of incentives where scarcity in some areas produces incentives that decrease scarcity over time, as we sort of mentioned with the example of meat and mining. So there's sort of a dialectic between scarcity and abundance, which is sort of implied in my essay.
Right. Can we explore a little more of how our concerns for these issues don't imply anarcho-primitivism as the solution? You sort of just touched on it with your last answer there, but can you flesh that out a little more?
Yeah, sure. So I think a good way of phrasing it would be that a certain level of technology and social complexity isn't necessarily tied to the set of social relations that happens to give rise to it. So I guess in other words, the social relations that can reproduce any given set of material conditions isn't fixed. So even though a lot of our technology is produced by capitalism, we can apply and develop it in a post-capitalist context. So what a lot of anti-civ anarchists do is, or an anti-civ and primitivist anarchists do, is that they'll say that, well, by using this, a similar sort of approach that I used in the essay, like, for example, they look at the state of mining today. They'll see these sort of sulfur miners who literally enter volcanoes to mine sulfur and then carry it out on their backs and then suffer lasting injuries. And they ask, well, who would do this? And my answer to that is that, well, it's actually the only sort of perspective put forth by anti-civ and primitivist anarchists that I find really is thought-provoking. And I think that's why a lot of people go in that direction. But I think they sort of go too far by simply saying that, yeah, well, based on what these things are like under capitalism, we just need to abolish them and we need to return to hunter-gatherers or an agricultural society. It always sort of varies. So what I would really predict is that, firstly, it's subjective. I think some people might still want to mine, but if we make certain assumptions, like the fact that, well, I don't think anyone, given other options, given more bargaining power in a market, I don't think workers would actually subject themselves to those kinds of labor conditions. But at the same time, you still have a demand for certain goods and services like medicine and like, especially if we think about these things in terms of supply chains, a lot of the things that are produced in highly exploitative ways are really just seen as essential goods in our current society. And I think that we could still produce them, but we would simply compensate workers that covers their disutility costs, wherein they're ultimately satisfied with their working conditions. There'd be investments into things like mine safety. And the end result of that would be making things more expensive. But at the same time, that leads to a whole host of new incentives. For example, we've talked about how the relative price of capital would actually go down as labor costs go up. So the primitivist sort of approach to this question is it sees things in a very static, possibly even ahistorical perspective. So what I'm really doing here is sort of using the same line of argumentation that many anti-civ and primitivists use, because I do find that particular logic, I do find that fairly compelling, but I would come to completely different conclusions to them.
So you end the article expressing how If we move toward automation that does not serve to increase profit margins, but rather create more free time, we could perhaps one day achieve post-scarcity anarchism. What would this world look like? And how would it differ from something like fully automated luxury anarchist communism?
Yeah, this was sort of a reference to fully automated luxury anarchist communism. More specifically, it was a reference to Kevin Carson's Free Market as Full Communism, which I thought was a really good essay. Free market competition incentivizes us to lower costs without having this option to simply externalize those costs onto others. So I think one particular expression of this incentive to lower costs is just it's an incentive to invest in new technology and new sustainable technology as well. So yeah, I think under capitalism, reducing costs often just means externalizing them onto workers. That's what they mean when they say that they want to sort of outsource labor to China or India. What they're really doing is externalizing costs onto workers by moving operations to where labor is cheaper, or externalizing costs onto the environment by moving somewhere where it's easier to pollute the environment. Whereas I think that anarchism creates a system of accountability where that kind of thing just wouldn't be possible because there's no power imbalance between different actors in a market.
All right. So I have 2 listener questions for you. Okay, the first listener question is, how would you respond to the criticism that non-market anarchists sometimes make, which is that even in a stateless context, markets would inevitably revert right back to capitalism?
It's kind of a fun question to answer because it's something I've talked about. I think all of us have really talked about and dealt with a lot because of that Marxist perspective that commodity production is what makes capitalism exploitative. But I would say that it's really state intervention in the economy, artificially privileging some groups over others, leading to sustained unequal exchange. It has nothing to do with the tools people use to relate to each other, like money. So I think what I would ask an anarchist who's skeptical of markets is, what exactly leads to the capitalist state of affairs? Is it the fact that people must labor in order to survive, or is it things like the historical mass expropriation of the commons and intellectual property and top-down property rights that lead to monopoly power? Like, there's no real historical precedent for structural imbalances of power simply emerging from markets. It's more that Karl Marx himself noted, which is that primitive accumulation was an extremely violent process, something Kevin Carson talks about in The Iron Fist Behind the Invisible Hand, which is the mass expropriation of the commons. So I think that in general, the emergence of states is at least historically speaking, a violent process. It's not something that simply emerges out of people voluntarily exchanging goods and services from each other. It's not really commodity production, which is an issue. Really, I would say that a good way of thinking about this is to think in terms of reciprocity, which kind of goes back to Proudhon, which is you have a situation where any sort of system and any voluntary system is underpinned by reciprocity. So in a commune, there is still a sort of implicit exchange taking place where if a member of the commune isn't satisfied with a particular arrangement, then they can renegotiate it or exit the commune. And in the same way, a market simply makes those underlying social relationships, those what I would really think of as exchanges, it simply makes them explicit and quantifies them. So yeah, I would say that that's really the main difference between market anarchism and anarcho-communism, just on a very fundamental level. So I don't really see any reason why authority simply emerges from markets. I don't think there's really a good argument for that.
All right. The second listener question is, to what extent are the radical changes in production and consumption you see as entailed by anarchy things that people can and should already begin directly applying today? And how much strategic value do you see in prefigurative attempts at, for example, some of the things you list, such as producing for use, recycling a lot more, engaging in permaculture, rewilding the suburbs, moving into smaller, denser communities, while investing in more durable, sustainable, decentralized technology. Versus perhaps a greater strategic emphasis on first dismantling capitalism so that these things will then become more possible.
I mean, I guess my answer to that would be that dismantling capitalism and prefigurative organizing are basically the same thing. Like actively building a new system creates a new set of incentives where some groups don't benefit at the expense of others. So I think the abolition of rule is a creative process. And in that sense, it's not just like the negation of the state by dismantling structures. I think that the creation of new institutions is implicit in dismantling capitalism, because if you're simply dismantling capitalism, all you're really left with is a power vacuum. And I don't think that benefits anyone. So I think that if you're working towards dismantling capitalism, then prefigurative organizing is a very important part of that.
Okay, so moving to the end of our conversation here, when should we expect more pieces from you in the future?
So I think from the future, you can see the piece I wrote on the upcoming C4SS mutual exchange on egoism, which I'm really looking forward to because that's a very interesting and contentious topic amongst anarchists. I'm also exploring right now, just yesterday, I had an idea to write about the stock market and the nature of equity ownership in a post-capitalist context. It's something I'm thinking a lot about. So yeah, I have a few ideas and I definitely enjoy writing and will continue to do so in the future. Generally, I don't focus on one topic. I just like to write about a range of things.
Cool. Where should folks go if they want to learn more about any of the topics that we've discussed today?
I think Kevin Carson touches on a lot of these topics. Kevin Carson's work is where I get a lot of the ideas behind the arguments. Like they talk a lot about the externalization of costs. So I think to learn more about the things we've discussed today, I think Kevin Carson is a great resource. A lot of Kevin Carson's essays were a big influence to me in writing Scarcity and Abundance under Anarchism. In particular, Moloch, mass production industry as a statist construct. And in terms of thinking about new technological trajectories that anarchism might take, I think Homebrew Industrial Revolution is a good resource. I think that about covers it.
All right. And where should folks go to support you or just to follow you and your work?
I think to follow my work, you can check out my Twitter, which is Railing56. And I'm also active on Discord.
Okay. And is there anything I forgot to ask you about that you'd like to touch on before we end the interview?
No, I think that about covers it. I just want to say thank you for taking the time to interview me. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So have I. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this with me. Railing, thanks again so much. And I look forward to more of your work in the future.
Okay, great.